Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here, my first time in Kansas City. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Code for America Brigade program. How many of you don't know what Code for America is? Oh, this is a friendly crowd. So just a quick overview. Code for America's mission is to build governments for the people, by the people that work in the 21st century. And that, work in the 21st century piece really means moving governments from structures that are defined by hierarchical organizations to ones that are defined by networked organizations. And obviously technology is a big piece of that. It's not the whole piece. And so a lot of what we do is about connecting, community organizing, grassroots networked community organizing tactics with technology and the tools that we need to make government work better and to connect citizens better with their government. So we've done a lot of work here in Kansas City. We were in a fellowship program. Kansas City was a fellowship city 2 years ago, and it has a very active brigade. Is Paul here? Raise your hand, Paul, if you're in the audience. I want to recognize Paul, who is the leader of our Brigade program in Kansas City. And the Brigade is our citizen volunteer arm. So, if the fellowship is sort of the go deep, the Brigade is our go wide. And the Brigade was formed a couple of years ago out of this desire to meet the demand of people who were really inspired by this idea that government could work better in the 21st century, but couldn't take a year off from their job to move to San Francisco and do a fellowship. And we also just couldn't fill demand for the number of people who wanted to do a fellowship. And so we said, well, why don't we organize people at the local level to do this work where they live, where they pay taxes, where they vote, where they send their kids to school on a volunteer basis, and really reactivate our sense of citizenship and create what really the Brigade has done is created a new channel for citizens to participate in not just voicing their opinion about how government should work better, but actually to roll up their sleeves and help build government in collaboration with city officials. So we started out in 2013 with 16 cities. We're now in 137 cities around the world, 83 of them in the US. I actually got updated numbers yesterday on our meetups. We have 16,646 members as of last night on Meetup, which is the main way that our groups organize. And we expanded in the fall of 2013 to include international cities in the Brigade program through our international partnership program, Code for All, which the communities team also runs. And so since this panel is about scaling communities, I'm just going to say a few words, since we only have a couple of minutes, about the things that we learned that we needed to do in order to scale. Going from 16 to 137, 16 in the US to 137 around the world in a couple of years requires building some social and technical infrastructure to support that growth in a way that we can really allow to maintain that balance between standardization and shared values with local control. And that's something we struggle with every day, is where you find that balance between letting 1,000 flowers bloom and the things that are letting the brigades and the volunteers work on things that are really relevant at the local level, with making sure that collectively we're all kind of pushing towards a common goal in the same way. Before the Brigade program, worked on President Obama's re-election campaign and took a lot of lessons from our organizing structure there and brought them to the Brigade program, the main one being moving from this sort of hub and spoke model where every communication sort of had to go through the central node of Code for America's national headquarters team, which was for the Brigade program 2 people at the time, to a snowflake model, a much more networked model, which has regional coordinators that sit between us and the local level, and also adding what we call core team members to bolster leadership and support at the very local level. So no longer is it just one person who we call a captain that leads the brigade, but there's a whole set of people, in some cases, 5 to 10 at the local level, who distribute leadership and then can help better support teams and support that growth. We've also started using a slew of new tools that kind of remove us from the switchboard mode. The biggest one is Slack. I don't know if there are some Slack users in the audience, but that's been a godsend for us, really. It's really helped us connect our community to each other, helped them answer each other's questions instead of us needing to sort of dictate the conversation, and has really helped us understand in a way that we never really could before, not just what's happening at the local level, but where the energy is around civic technology, really at the grassroots. So next steps, I think the big thing to note is that growth is not really our goal. And when we talk about scaling community, we do want to have the tools in place to support anyone who wants to come. But we need to stick to not just looking at the numbers as in terms of what our impact is, but really, are we doing better work? Are we supporting the groups that already exist to make the next step? And how is their work changing? How are they from year to year developing more authority and doing more meaningful projects and sort of building on what they've done in the past? The other big priority for us is diversification. We have a saying at Code for America in the communities team, we want to work for everyone, not anyone. So it's not enough to just open the doors and say anyone is welcome. You have to be a lot more intentional about who you're bringing to the table. And our community can't do the work that it needs to do if it's not representative of the cities where it works. And so we really make sure that all of the chapters understand who their community is, and that everyone, or they're doing as much as they can to bring everyone in the community to the table. So those are just a few things, ideas to throw out. Happy to take that conversation in any direction you guys want later. Passing it over to Dan.
That was good. Awesome. Next up, it's you, Chris. Chris Lawrence from Mozilla and Hive.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Let me get my clicker in place here and my notes in front of me. So, to be perfectly frank, this is going to be a little bit of real-time processing, not because we don't have a plan or know what we're doing, but we're in the midst of figuring out what it means to scale, and I think more importantly, spread the Hive work. And so this is something that I would certainly not want to come up with any kind of preconceived notions that we've figured it out or in some way are scaling it large. But we do think we have a model and a program and a plan that is starting to get us to there, really leaning into the spread part as much as the scale. So a little caveat there. So what the heck is Hive, you're probably saying? That's something that bees do? Well, the idea of Hive, and you can read there, but I think what it really is what does it take to bring together the educators and the organizations in a city to really look at how you prepare youth for success in today's networked world, and to start to think of themselves as networks within their individual cities, and this really is a city strategy, and then how do you link them globally? So if I could be, we're really looking for both wide but also deep impact, and how we go for that is to really identify and grow individual cities and make sure that it starts to have the impact and agency and networked capacity within those cities to first spread and scale within those large and even small and medium-sized cities. Because if you're not making an impact in those cities that you've put a stake in the ground, then scaling past that becomes silly anyway. So we've been working a lot in the last year, as I admitted, on kind of identifying what is that big, hairy, audacious goal, and then how do we build the scaffolding and the network around that. And so we've really been thinking a lot about here, and I'm just going to read this because if you work that long on something, you might as well not butcher the wording, right? So we imagine a time when connected learning is ubiquitous. Of course, that's what my screen does. Ubiquitous in Hive cities across the globe, empowering educators and unlocking opportunities for all youth. And so how we've started to go about that, and you got to have your verbs. So if you start to think about the verbs that we organize to do this in the individual cities, and then growing demand for new cities to take on this approach, and the one caveat on that is that it's deeply local. So in no way are we think that this is a prescriptive model that you just fork into a new city. It really is, what are the guidebooks? What are the people practices? What does it take to actually have the ideas that resonate city to city, and then quickly link them to the local needs, realities, and people that are driving that? And so at its core, Hive is really a peer professional development network for the educators, for the technologists, for the librarians, for the folks that are working in that intersection of informal and formal learning, which, as we all know, is starting to really blend and become a much less distinction between what's happening in formal and informal learning, and we hope to live in that soft middle. And what we do is that educators within this network, both representing themselves as individuals and the organizations that they work for, are inventing and sharing new ways to teach, not technology for technology's sake, but really looking at what is problem solving, creativity, and digital skills that's going to drive their success in an emerging digital world. And then from an organizational standpoint, how do you roll those distributed innovations within the Hive network into programs, into policy, and into how these organizations actually do their education outreach in the digital world, in the goal of giving young people that resiliency, those combination of hard and soft skills that's then going to grow them as having the agency and efficacy to go forward in their lives. So I talk a lot about spread with scale. We're Mozilla, we're a tech company and a tech nonprofit, but what we really think is the deep investment in people as the network and having the technological capacity of what we're talking about over here in the next couple days, go along with a people network that can empower and drive that. And I think about our work here in Kansas City and Chattanooga with US Ignite and NSF. It's really about what's it like to take the promise and the goals of these connected cities and actually look at our educators and youth to be the driving force of where the innovations come from, where the best use cases are, and what's actually starting to matter in the lives of those educators and youth. And so to do that is really to build the person-to-person network within the city and then broadly, and then to have sort of, if I can really butcher a biology metaphor, what's that infection strategy from person to person that starts to carry that forward and to spread those ideas to eventually get to scale. I don't want to go too much into Mozilla history, but one thing that's super interesting about Mozilla was that it had, in the early days, a mission to keep the web open and to protect open standards, and it knew it was never going to have the money, people, or even technical expertise at scale to take on the Microsofts of the world. And so it deeply knew in the early days that a community and an individual connected individual program was what was going to be able to take that on. And that's exactly what they've done and what we've continued to do as Mozilla the company, and what in the foundation and the work in Hive really started to think about how that looks and scales in other sectors like education. So from a pure strategy standpoint, we've really started to look at what the developmental model is for new cities, really looking at the city first and then connecting them to each other. So we've really been thinking about an events community network model. So quickly, events, that can be best represented by our Maker Party campaign. We've just come off the third summer of that Maker Party campaign. This past summer, we had over 2,500 events globally and 450 cities around the world, doing the kind of making culture, building youth and adults together in digital worlds and even in the intermingling of the digital and analog world, and that is the catalytic moments, those kind of teach-ins and hack jams and convenings that start to bring that network together and then start to germinate that growing on and larger and larger. And then from that event strategy, what's it like to then start to identify those key stakeholders, build them into a community, have a framework for and a cadence for what kind of meetings, how to run a meeting, where to have a meeting so that we can help cities build around, and then work with them to go and find the funding and those structures to actually launch a network, which has, a dedicated staff, it has its own funding, so on and so forth. So just to give you an idea about where we're going, and I was focusing on national here, so you can see where we are in current cities. Kansas City is a great example of a community that is moving into becoming a fledged Hive learning network, probably within the next couple months. So spending a year working and building those community infrastructures, funding the Gigabit innovation projects, and collating that into something that has a staff, that has funds, that can actually start to replicate that and be an example to others. But we also are international. Bangalore, Manchester, Vancouver, and Toronto, we very much see this as having hives across the globe, but this is where we are currently nationally. And so this just was a convening that we did as Mozilla, the Mozilla Festival in London, which we do every year. And it was a really powerful moment to sort of understand that people network, where we had over 100 educators, technologists, designers, library staff, museum staff, classroom teachers come together. And it was actually driven by our Gigabit work in Chattanooga. Lindsay over here ran and curated that entire track around Hive at the Mozilla Festival. And what was important was it was actually when you can bring people together, even for a short amount of time, what that rubbing of shoulders does is they can go back and take those ideas and those practices, and more importantly, that connectivity, to do that spread, to work to scale. And I want to be cognizant of not monopolizing the time and having a dialogue with all of you, so I will cap my talk there. There is some of my contact info. Happy to connect further or tweet at me or whatnot, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Okay, and then we'll hear from Bill Wallace from US Ignite.
Thanks very much. I'd like to talk about our focus. We're focused on the what now. Now you have a gigabit network or a high-speed network. What do you do with it? What applications and services can be created to benefit your community and other communities? We were launched at the White House 2.5 years ago with support from the National Science Foundation, who really wanted to prime the pump. A little bit like where we were in 1992, 93 with the early internet. What are we going to do with this? What's the next browser? What's the next email? What are the next platforms that can, like virtual reality, that can be used to improve our competitiveness in the world? And it is essential for us to do this. So we were launched. Today we have roughly 36 communities who've joined with US Ignite, 20 commercial and foundation partners who are working with us. Most recently, Winthrop, Minnesota, Highland, Illinois joined us, Jackson, Tennessee, and NC Engine in North Carolina. We're thrilled to have you as new members, and look forward to working very closely with you. We're a public-private partnership, as I said, with both corporate sponsors, foundations, universities, and communities. We work in this range, and I'm not going to describe it in a lot of detail because my colleague Glenn Reichert, my colleague and friend Will Barker is going to describe it in more detail at 2 o'clock, talking about specific applications. But we work in this line between applications that trade off amount of data to be transferred and the speed at which that data is transferred. A lot of great things can happen when you take the time to educate people about what the possibilities are. And no one is better than that than my colleague Glenn Reichert. It's a little bit like being in 92, 93, and what are we going to do with this internet thing? And it takes some doing. It's awfully easy to fall back on applications and services that run on today's internet. So we're pretty good at getting people out of their comfort zone to get into this zone. And we're almost like a funnel. We come up with, hopefully as a catalyst for great ideas. Some come from universities, some come from our own ideas, some come from hackathons, maker fairs we work with you to run in your communities. Some come from our corporate partners like Juniper and Verizon, Comcast, EPB, all over the country. We've been working, by the way, with Chattanooga, Kansas City, Lafayette, Louisiana, and Burlington, Vermont over the last 2.5 years to try to increase this funnel and get it to, we're not doing entertainment applications. We think the free market's going to take care of that real fast, but we want to prime the pump and create a critical mass in these areas: healthcare, clean energy, education, advanced manufacturing, emergency preparedness, and transportation. And we've been doing that. In terms of scaling, Glenn and Joe and I, my partner Joe Kochan, have been flying around the country with PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets and hopefully motivating talks. But to scale from the 36 cities we have today to the 200 we seek, we've set up with the help of Mozilla an exchange. It's our website, but it's called the Collaborative Community Exchange, or CCX, where you can go as a community and find applications that have been developed that may meet your needs in public safety or transportation. Similarly, developers can find out from you in your communities what applications you need and then develop them to work with you. It's already started to work in a frictionless basis, so the days of always flying around with PowerPoints hopefully are over. We'll be there if you need us, but hopefully some of this is happening. We've had a number of associations and government agencies find applications on this site. So really creating a clearinghouse or an exchange to make a big difference. Yesterday we touched on what makes a successful ecosystem, and I just wanted to reflect on what we've seen in the 36 cities we've worked in. And not a lot of differences from yesterday, but just wanted to emphasize broad-based accelerator team. And in Chattanooga, that's the Enterprise Center. In Burlington, it's BTV Ignite. In Flint, Michigan, it's Flint Ignite. Often, by broad-based, I mean it's 25 people. All parts of the city are involved, including educators, including the local providers, including the mayors. And you can't, there's no downside to being too inclusive. A real long-term focus is not going to happen overnight. Community infrastructure, really important to connect anchor institutions. In Burlington, they've connected every school, as they have in Flint. Flint, Michigan has 10 gigabit speeds to every high school and every university in the community. It was a little kind of an unknown asset that's being used to leverage economic development. Constant stream of activities every weekend, a maker fair, hackathon, and then best practice sharing, not only in terms of sharing applications among communities, which is a key to scaling, but also sharing some of the best practices we heard about yesterday. And then leveraging national partnerships. There's money there at National Science Foundation and DOJ for application development in this new area. Other reasons, real fast, most of these have been touched on yesterday, but be sure to involve universities. Great skills often locked in universities that can be drawn out for the benefit of your community. Recognize, make it clear, and I've used the 92-93 example, make it clear to the hackers and the young developers and entrepreneurs in your community that you have a platform very much like the platform that Mark Andreessen had in 92-93 before he created Mosaic. It's there for the taking. There are not a lot of big companies competing, so there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity. And be sure to engage as many civic organizations as you can. Bob Metcalfe, one of our board members and inventor of Ethernet, has often made the case that people thought in the 70s that 50 kilobits was going to be too much. So here where we are now. He also invented, Herb C. yesterday mentioned Metcalfe's law. And it's very important. It's the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of connected users. So we want to grow. We want to grow. Herb also said don't get too big. So we want to grow. We think 200 is a good target over the next 4 years because that's a good number of communities that can share and add value to each other without degrading the quality. His advice yesterday was to stop growing if you're not adding the quality, and we will adhere to that advice. Okay, in terms of connecting communities, we are in the process of preparing a National Science Foundation proposal called Sustainable Ecosystem of Smart Cities that will connect what will start off as 10 or 11 cities, growing to 25 cities, growing to 200 cities over time. And this will provide a fiber connection across the communities, but also most important, equally important, a platform we call a Locavore Platform for making it very easy to share applications across your communities and to share best practices on how to develop the ecosystem. So it's twofold. It's not just great ideas for applications, but it's also great ideas from one community to the other. So in this proposal, we are offering, and by the way, we've identified 9 or 10, maybe 10 communities, but we have slots for another couple ones in this first phase. But our goal is to make it sustainable so we can grow to 200 over time. We'd love to talk to you after this if you would like to join up over the next couple of years. But we promise to connect the cities, provide this Locavore equipment infrastructure, and share our best practices, as well as a video wall for sharing ideas. In return, the communities participating agree to develop at least 2 applications to share with other communities, as well as to adopt some of the best practices that we've talked about in the last couple of days. So hopefully a win-win, and hopefully a way to, again, on a relatively frictionless basis, scale what we do to come up with the applications and services that we'll look back on fondly in the next 10 years, kind of like we look back on the Mosaic browser. In closing, Aaron's done a great job of recommending books. I just finished reading this book, Walter Isaacson, called The Innovators, and it's amazing how many parallels you will see to today. We've laid a very fertile ground. We've got a platform very much like the early 90s, and we're looking for that kid out there. There's a great story in here about Bill Gates at Harvard. Sophomore read the January 1974 looked at the cover of Popular Electronics, and there was an Altair computer on it. And he and his partner Ballmer and others quit school because they saw that the market was going to pass them by. There's some kid in your community today that once he or she understands what the gigabit fiber can do, is going to be the next Bill Gates. And it's up to us to kind of educate them, get the platform in place, educate them, and I urge you to read this book. Thanks for the time.
Awesome. Okay, we have about 20 minutes to talk about the many issues you just brought up. Definitely want to hear any questions from the audience as well. The questions are not up there, so don't look at that. That's not as relevant as it was an hour ago. But I'm sure we'll be able to have questions. Catherine, you talked about using simple tools like Slack to sort of flatten leadership and to allow for less central control. And you also, I love the phrase, everyone, not anyone. How do you handle, from even a technology tool point of view, the idea that you, as someone running the brigade from a central place, cannot be in contact with everybody on Slack who would get those 16,000 people who are on Meetup? How do you guys deal with that?
I think that's kind of the key to being an organizer, is you have to really, that has to be your goal, not to be in contact with everyone all the time. Otherwise, you don't have a network. The goal for me is to build an infrastructure, to build and support an infrastructure where everyone feels like they know where they're going, they're empowered to do so, and that they can learn from each other. And so that's certainly not something that keeps me up at night, to know that I can't be in touch with everyone all the time, because I know they can be in touch with each other, and that's really the goal.
Not something you're solving. That's awesome.
Not what? Sorry?
Not something you're solving. It's not something that's...
It's something where, I learned on the Obama campaign, the best organizers are the ones who delegate themselves out of a job. So you're not doing organizing well if you haven't given away all the work there is to do to other people.
Chris and Bill, how do you handle that kind of communication at the absolute? You both run larger networks with all sorts of people and describe the institutions and people you interact with. How do you handle, from either a tool perspective or a plain communication perspective, deal with interacting with the people, the on-the-ground people who are working?
Doing a lot of traveling. We've also created this frictionless exchange to exchange ideas. But one of the great things that's mentioned in this book is the importance of letting collaboration happen. So we try to encourage, whenever we communicate with the communities involved in US Ignite, we try to communicate the importance of mix of talents. There's the visionaries and the doers, the people who are experimentalists, the people who are theorists. And we try to encourage that mix, because that's where unbelievable genius happens. And we communicate with our communities by having a monthly video conference. As I mentioned, if we're successful in this proposal at NSF, we'll have a video wall that'll make that much easier to communicate. We're not so much directing communities what to do, it's more serving as a catalyst role and sharing best practices. We hope to do that through the exchange, through more of a constant video contact. And by the way, a lot of people like Pew suggest that the killer apps are going to be in the area of interactive communication and virtual reality training. Those are going to be some of the early killer apps coming out of what we're doing here in this event.
There we go. For us, I think, it's really about, we are really a hyper-local network at this point, with growing global connectivity and aspirations. So what that really means is, what does it mean for that local entity to figure those things out for themselves in a way that makes them locally produced and thus relevant and authentic to the communities that build them. Of course, we have suggestions and best practices that we have, but we've seen where some of those best practices have died on the rocks very quickly when a new city starts to implement them. So it's a lot less, I think, agree about the tooling specifically, although there are lots of fabulous tools, and we have some and we test drive them often. But it really is about listening. I think maybe is my most important takeaway, is listening to the communities and letting their stuff emerge, and then providing a context which they can globally connect, and share is probably our most robust practice at this point for that. The other thing is, because we're taking a hyper-local approach and then linking those hyper-localities together, it's about physical face-to-face interactions as much as possible and a regular cadence for that to happen.
You had also mentioned the idea of educators and youth being the driving force in person-to-person communications. I found that it's hard to actually be _led, youth-led, community-led, any kind of led. I mean, can you drill into that a little deeper, into maybe an experience where maybe you weren't really buying into what they wanted to do, but they did it anyway? I mean, lots of times, again, we're talking about large networks and then implementation at the local level. So is there any example where they led from the local level and that made you uncomfortable?
There's probably lots of little examples. I don't think there's one explicitly yet, although, and I don't want to spin this as a negative, but an interesting one actually that's relevant here is how you actually leverage the Hive model to think about how you connect these gig cities. And so the gig cities come with their whole set of larger stakeholders, issues, organizational memory. And so I think it's been an exciting problem, and I wouldn't even frame it as a problem, but how to take the Hive model and intertwine it with these gig cities. For us has been Kansas City and Chattanooga, but then, and hopefully adding more. But how do you, because that isn't necessarily the goal of the model, to support and grow broadband adoption for economic development. That's not the Hive model at its core. And so less about being pushed, but more about the growth path, about what it's like to actually build that together. And there's obviously tension and pain points. So at the sort of larger scale, I think that might be one of the better examples, although I am just ecstatic about what we've been able to build and do on that, but it's presented some of those similar problems. On a smaller local level, I would suggest that we have been less concerned about sort of fidelity to the model or to the ideas, and by letting boutique projects have the space in which to push the network back. And yes, those might be small and boutique, but if you can aggregate them, they start to tell a collective story. And so we have been very intentional in individual cities to let those projects breathe and to not sort of judge them prematurely before they have actually the chance to impact and inform the network.
Yep. Bill, do you have something?
You'd asked about a situation where what's coming up from the grassroots level is something that you disagree with. And in our case, all ideas are good ideas until proven otherwise. But the one area where we have to inject ourselves is this idea of what does it mean to leverage next generation technologies? It is very difficult, and you'll find in your communities that there will be dozens of entrepreneurs who think they're leveraging today's next generation, but they're actually just using today's internet. So it's really hard to break them out of the mindset, and it requires thinking about not just speed, but latency and symmetric speed, what we call locavore computing and software-defined networking. There are all these elements that are hard to understand, and sometimes, so we have to inject ourselves and kind of overrule and say, yeah, but that's really not taking full advantage of the network you have in your community. And I can't agree more with Chris. By the way, we like the virtual frictionless communication, but there's no substitute for face-to-face, physical proximity, density, and chance encounters. In this book, The Innovators, it's amazing how many chance encounters occurred at the long hallways of Bell Labs or in Silicon Valley that are so important. You can't plan for it.
Bill, you'd also mentioned the phrase anchor institutions and how much value there is locked in universities. I found that in lots of my experience there, I find that to be the case as well. There's a huge chasm, it seems, between universities and communities in lots of areas, even though I find that there are lots of programs to stop that from happening. So can you give us an
yeah,
example
no,
of where it wins?
Yeah, it's amazing. A lot of the universities and the researchers in the universities, sometimes there's some bureaucracy above the researchers that will keep you from getting in. But you find the experts, the subject matter experts, and great things will happen. Just ask them. Let me give you an example. And by the way, these universities have had tens of millions of dollars spent, and I think Hugh Herb mentioned yesterday, leveraging the DNA of your community. What are you good at? And often what you're good at can be found in the universities. You know, in Burlington, the University of Vermont has 5 pillars of excellence. They've invested tens of millions of dollars in. Ask them to share that with the rest of the community. And it's amazing. They'll do it. It sometimes takes some hassle. Let me give you a really good example. There's a researcher in USC who has the world's leading digital microscope. Okay? And he's a major research institution that doesn't often reach smaller communities. But because Chattanooga has a gigabit fiber, he has been able to make a gigabit connection to Chattanooga's STEM biology class. So there's a 6-week STEM class where the students are going to be able to manipulate the microscope and look at microorganisms in the Pacific Ocean and be trained by research assistants and students at USC. And if that model works in the small NSF-funded pilot, it can be scaled so that research universities, and there's 65 research universities connected to US Ignite network, that can take that capabilities and bring it out. But it's just ask. Short answer.
Catherine, I think you and Code for America have done a great job of growing the Brigade program in a really logical, non-crazy way, and you say it's actually a strategy that you're employing, that it's not just growth for growth's sake.
That's crazy that we have a strategy for growth.
To have a strategy for controlled, reasonable growth. What's the biggest thing that led to that sort of accounts for the growth you have had? I mean, what's the biggest factor?
I mean, that organizing infrastructure that I talked about before, again, and this is, we can't scale, given the amount of resources we have as Code for America, to the number of cities that we want to reach, operating in a centralized hub and spoke kind of way. We have to operate as a network, and that takes intentional practices. And so moving from a place where, in a set of tools where all of the communication had to be routed through us, to a structure where people and groups could support each other, and that the groups on the ground are more sustainable, that's essentially the work that we have to do. And we're pretty close to being at a place where now we can move from implementing that infrastructure to really, and where, at this point, it's just about fully automated for someone to start a chapter and get up and running. They don't have to talk to us at all. And that's really important for us in order to concentrate on the bottom of the funnel, where the work is really happening and where these volunteers can have the most impact in their community. And that's why I mentioned helping them develop strategic plans and helping them think through inclusion strategies. And in many cases, inspired by the Smart Chicago model, how can they develop local sustainable organizations that have a business model and that can be a home for the volunteer activity? So those are the things that we needed to do. There's a whole organizing philosophy that we paid for it. We had consultants that I used to work with on the Obama campaign come in and help us really think through how that should work for Code for America, and we're about done implementing it. Again, Slack has been huge for us. We had this whole grand idea that we were going to build a network platform that was going to connect all of Code for America's communities, and it ended up being Slack and Discourse, which is a forum tool, and they're off the shelf, is Slack open source? No, yeah. But super lightweight, small pieces loosely joined, and they work. It doesn't need to be this whole behemoth thing. The face-to-face is also super important for us too. So I like to talk about infrastructure in both the technical sense, but also the social sense. What kind of culture are we helping to foster?
Mm-hmm. Any questions from the gallery at this time? What do you got?
Came out of Europe, and is there any collaborations happening, I guess, with any of these organizations and some of the leading initiatives happening in Europe?
We have focused primarily on the U.S., but we just started to scratch the surface of connections through the internet. What's the next generation internet, Glenn? What's it called? The next.
Well, there's the Future Internet Public-Private Partnership in Europe. It's very similar to US Ignite.
Yeah, so we're starting to partner with our peer. We've also begun to understand better what's going on globally in the Internet of Things through a NIST program that we're working on called Global City Teams Challenge, and just starting to get in there. So, short answer, mainly focused on the U.S., but starting to take the best ideas. One of the things that's interesting, we find often that there's a top-down influence in terms of creating new applications in Europe, whereas we're more bottoms up, and we've benefited a lot from that approach here. So.
Go ahead.
How do all of these activities scale downward to a new fledgling gigabit community the size of the city of Chanute, Kansas, 9,200 people in a gigabit network?
I mean, I'll take a quick answer, and then Chris, Catherine can answer. But it's Red Wing, Minnesota is not that much bigger than that, and they've set up an incubator. They set up a small equity fund for small business. They've got a gigabit network. They've got a deal or a project going with Mayo Clinic. The same activities can occur no matter what size. There's lower critical mass, so it's a little harder. But if you have a gigabit network, it's amazing. Like in Red Wing, they're able to bring in experts from Minneapolis because they have that network, and they'll come in for a hackathon. In fact, the Red Hot Hack, the so-called Red Hot Hack, is happening next week. So same best practices that we talked about yesterday work in a small community as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's true for us. The tools and the resources you need to get started are agnostic as to the type of community you're in. You just need to be able to pull some people together in a room. And like I said, it's really important that we create a sort of framework, but that the activity at the local level is driven by local need. And the local need in a community of 9,200 people with gigabit fiber is going to be different than what it is in LA. And so we need those communities to define what their work is themselves. And that really, I mean, going to Dan's question about do we ever get freaked out by the stuff that bubbles up from the grassroots? It actually leads us, that's where we get intelligence about how we should be developing our strategy. So I would say when that stuff starts emerging, we can identify the themes and then start investing in programming and support for the things that are starting to emerge. We saw our local brigade in Philadelphia spur a partnership with Girl Develop It, which we have now taken from them, their lessons, and developed it into a national partnership. So if there were a bunch of there was someone at our meetup last night who, from rural Minnesota, who said, we want to start a brigade in rural communities. How do we get started? And you tell us, start it. We have, the resources that we can share with you, but really you're going to be the ones who help inform us about how the program should grow in the future.
Any final thoughts on that, Chris? I think we have maybe time for one.
I'll add just really quick. I think what's really exciting is that, after years of, when you pick New York and Chicago as your first two, you've got many war wounds and bloody foreheads. But it's a little bit like swinging 4 or 5 bats on the on-deck circle, right? So what's been really informative about Chattanooga is it's been the smallest city that we've tried this model in so far, and to be able to leverage the existing relationships, the existing connectivity, the existing excitement has been rocket fuel for the ideas and for the adoption. And so we find that those smaller labs, so to speak, are really exciting because you actually can get feedback at a higher clip and you can actually build. And I think the value add back to those smaller cities and communities is that then we can give them connections to larger conversations and to start to level up the stuff that happens in those cities into broader conversations, and start to make them feel more connected and to sort of flatten, where those innovations come from.
Excellent. Sure, one more.
In the next few days, the FCC will release their proposed regs for net neutrality. How will that impact US Ignite and Code for America? Because it's going to turn into a political maelstrom, it looks like.
We stay out of that fight, but know that it's obviously foundational work for us, and are on the sidelines cheering on everyone who's actually on the battlefield. We just aren't big enough to also take on the telecom policy battles as well. So foundational for civic technology, but we got to focus on the civic technology.
Yeah, similarly, we rely on places like the Fiber to Home Council and Next Century Cities to fight the policy battles. We do make available data that suggests that if you have a gigabit network that's software defined and low latency, some of these issues become far less important. Fast lanes become far less important because if the baseline, let's say the baseline somewhere down the road is 300 megabits per second, there's less concern about slow lanes and fast lanes. If you have a smart network, some of the issues become less relevant. So we try to inform the debate as opposed to taking sides. And we stay focused on applications and services. We find that's a better way to keep our mission forefront.
So let me just quickly answer this. It's certainly not my area of expertise, but Mozilla is very much in that fight, and so is deeply invested.
Yay.
And because we're in that fight, and we have that policy expertise and those professionals within the organization. From an education standpoint, this summer we very much took on from using the Hive network model as a place for teach-ins, for the place of exploring those issues at the educator and youth level. So building that, whether you want to call it web or digital literacy at that education level is the piece within Mozilla that we took on as a way to just grow the literacy of the issues, and then work with the Mozilla policy people just to get us smart answers for that, and then to support them building understanding and community and momentum towards the side we're on in net neutrality.